Hey, this is Anthony and
Stu from the UberCubeMTGPodCast.
hey, and we wanted to discuss the tragic events that have occurred during this week and the importance that everyone knows that this cube community is exactly what it is. It's a community, and we're all impacted by what happens to one another.
Yeah, we have unfortunately lost someone who was certainly very close to Anthony and I, as well as not just people that were involved with the most wonderful CubeCon event that our dear friend, Mr. Jonathan Brostoff, was a part of, but also the Magic community, the Cube community in general, and as a loving friend and husband and father that sadly passed away this week.
What's really important is it touches all of our lives. And what I want the listeners to know is that help does exist. If you are, and I hope everyone's well, but if you're feeling that things aren't right, that just things aren't lining up the way you need, there are people who you can reach out to. And specifically, you can call 988 or text 988. It's a suicide hotline. It's for people who need to reach out and need to ask for help. So it's very important that we express that.
Absolutely. If you don't have someone, either your friends, your family, anyone in your near circle that you can reach out to, ask for help. It doesn't matter who you might be speaking to, but there's people out there that care, that want to get you the help that you need, that really do love you. And don't hesitate to get the help that you need. If you have any kinds of feelings of depression or any kind of mental health issue, whatever it may be, give someone a call. Make sure you're doing right by yourself. And we love you all.
Thanks for listening. Welcome to UberCube, the podcast we discuss all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, a.k.a. UberBear, and today we've got our most amazing host here in Iowa right now. You know who you are.
No, I don't know. I don't know who that is. I don't know who you're talking about.
And then we got this guy.
Is this person in the room with you right now?
We got the one that shows up, the one that has all the tech.
It is. It's
Hi, it's me. It's May.
Good. But tell us who else we have today.
Who do we have today? Who's our esteemed guest?
Oh, hello. It's me. You probably knew this already because I was in the title of the episode. But surprise, it's me, Gavin Verhey. I'm a principal game designer on Magic the Gathering, so I design what a lot of those wacky cardboard rectangles do. And I also am kind of in charge of a lot of the stuff with Commander that we do internally. So I lead the charge on that format. And I'm also a huge cube aficionado. Fun fact is I had the first cube that I know of in Seattle. And so many, many years ago, before Wizards, so that was a long time ago, people would come over to my house like 3 times a week to cube because that was the only cube in town, right? So people would come on in and we would draft and have a good time. And I was the cube guy. I ran the Cube forum on MTG Salvation. Like that was totally my thing. So Cube is very much baked into my DNA. I've always loved it. Super fun format. And I've been to CubeCon all 3 years. So really happy to get the chance to talk with you all now.
Good. Yeah, we've seen you in your typical really cool, like, where do you get these sweet jackets from? I got to ask the question. You have the most amazing jackets.
Well, you mean like the suit jackets?
Yes.
Yeah, they're nice. You get wonderful colors.
I use a mix of tailors who I look for specific stuff from. And then there's a local company, like a little small local company called Amazon that I also purchase from. They're Seattle local. And, I just love buying local.
Can you give us the URL for that company, maybe, for this Amazon? I don't know if maybe our listeners could benefit from that, if they've never heard
there's
of
another small company that is really helpful for finding things. It's called Google. And if you use them, you can maybe find this Amazon place.
As a tech guy, I'm baffled. I'm getting schooled right now. But
yeah, I just can't help to notice, like, your style is impressive. I got to give you that. I've been holding back to say that, and that's the one thing I will say is every time I see your outfits are just fantastic.
Yes.
You have to take that
Thanks.
one. You have to. They're just you got style.
I dress myself every day.
Yeah, you do.
Every day is an opportunity.
All right, we're gonna have a little bit of fun with this. But we're gonna do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're gonna enjoy our libations of the show, and we're gonna start out with our esteemed guest, Gavin. What are you having today, Gavin?
What am I drinking? Well, it's 2:30 on a work day, so I'm drinking water. That's right, you heard it here. I'm drinking water. Really, I don't. Fun fact about me, a lot of people don't know, is I don't drink caffeine at all. So no coffee, no tea. It's actually pretty strange. I've met very few people that are this way. It's just me and Mark Rosewater. I don't know how that happened. But we're not caffeinated people, despite the fact of how high energy we seem. So I just got some nice water here. I'm going to enjoy it. Just glubbing my fishy way through.
That's cool. You know what?
Very nice. Very nice.
I'm not completely surprised. You seem like, you're a pretty on the level kind of guy, right? But Maro, that does surprise me a little bit about him because, like you say, he's super. The reason why I love him is I see a lot of the hyper, like super excited that I tend to get, told that I'm like that I'm very passionate and very animated when I talk and I'm waving my hands around all the time. But yeah, that's cool. Good to know.
Not me. Mm-hmm. I have the coffee, the 5-hour energy, and I follow that up with like a diet Red Bull. That's how I keep my eyes open every day. May, what are you having? You are the drink aficionado. You always outclass us. What do you have today?
Well, you are correct. I am going to be outclassing you again. I actually went with a tequila rosé with creme de coco and mixed it with some oat milk to give it a sort of strawberry chocolate milk type flavoring.
See, Gavin, this is what we deal with every time.
It does sound good, honestly.
So you got style.
Yeah. It's dangerously, deceptively good. It tastes just like strawberry chocolate milk.
And so Stu did us a courtesy because we just surpassed, we're kind of celebrating here. We're celebrating because we got Gavin on the show. And we're celebrating because we surpassed 50,000 downloads this week. So we are in celebration mode a little bit. We're going to cube after this. So we've had a great time. But he picked us up a nice Glenmorangie 14. What is that? Which cask is that?
This is the bourbon and port cask.
See, it's delicious. I like a nice little single malt scotch every once in a while. But yeah, so great to have you on the show. Super
excited.
Catch
me after hours and I'll grab a scotch of my own. We'll have a very different kind of show.
All right. That's a date. That's a date.
Roger that. So we got questions. This is just out of the gate. We're going to go straight into it. We love this cube. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've been just frantically drafting this cube. I think I might have your medal now. I've been drafting this thing at least 3-4 times a day minimum, and I've been just trying to learn this cube. And Stu and I were talking about this pre-gaming. I have fallen in love with this cube. Like, it's fantastic. I regret not cubing this at CubeCon, to be honest with you. So, what inspired this cube?
Okay, so my cube, regular games commander cards, just to give people kind of a rundown of what it is, I guess. So it's normal Magic. Everything about it is normal. In fact, when people ask about, hey, does your cube have any special rules? The rule I always have to say is, the rule is there are no special rules. Because you think there's going to be a bunch when I tell you what it is. So 20 life, 40 card decks, add basic lands, everything as usual, singleton cube, whatever. The only difference is, all the cards from the cube are cards that originally premiered in Commander products. So either Commander decks, new cards in Commander decks, or new cards from like Commander Legends, something like that. So it's got a very unique kind of look where the most common feedback I get on it is usually I feel like I'm drafting a set I've never seen before, because most players have never seen these cards in their entire lives, especially a lot of the competitive-minded players, right? So if you're a competitive player playing Cube Draft, a lot of times you haven't seen these cards. And so where it kind of came from, honestly, it kind of came from two places. One is just that I'm the Commander-focused guy at Wizards, so I thought it would make a lot of sense for me to make a cube that had something to do with Commander. But I also love competitive Magic, so I thought it was like a nice little way to fuse those two. I wasn't going to try and make cube players who like one-on-one play competitive or play Commander, but I wanted them to use some cards. And I love a good challenge. I love seeing if I can do something, if it's even possible. When I first had the idea for doing this cube, I had a lot of different ideas in my head of what I might need to do to make it work. Like, do I need to make some rule about you have a commander or something like that? I considered making it the ancillary cube, where you could use any cards from ancillary products. So Battle Bond and Conspiracy would also become eligible. But when I built the cube out, it actually just worked. Like I've made a bunch of tweaks, don't get me wrong, since the first iteration. But when I built it out, like, the curve is like a little different from normal, but it's actually not. Like, there's fewer 1-drops because there aren't a lot in Commander products. There's still plenty of 2-drops to go around. You have to prize them a little bit higher. The mana is a little bit worse, but it just kind of works. And the experience is really novel, both literally and figuratively, because there's a lot of cards you've never seen before. That makes it very novel. And a lot of them have a lot of text to read. And so that also makes it a novel. So there is there's a lot of unique stuff going on and a lot of like little synergies built in. But yeah, I've had a lot of fun working on it and tweaking it. The other thing for me is it's just, frankly, I have my time is in such a position where I have so little time that something that really narrowed the scope would be really good for me. And so trying to make a cube with everything in Magic, there's just so many options. But with Commander cards, there's, only a few thousand. And so it becomes a lot easier to narrow down the ones you want to put in.
I see an analog when I look at it to my Fem cube, as I've been studying your cube. And my Fem cube, if you're not familiar with it, it's based on the women in Magic. And so I find myself having to parse through all of Magic's history, like looking for, like recently you had a secret lair that came out that I was excited about that's Snapcaster Mage. Unfortunately, I'm priced out of that scenario, but or a Blood Artist is a better example where I recently picked that up. But the challenge that I find is finding, kind of like your rule, you're saying it's not a Commander card. It must be originally printed in Commander. Is that correct?
Yeah. It must originally have come from a Commander deck or a Commander set. Yeah.
Well, you're going to see some of my challenges in the outline that kind of, I picked cards out of not completely understanding that philosophy was kind of the point that I was going to drive home. And I respect it because very much like when friends told me we should play test a card that has a different art on it that doesn't fit that requirement. Mine was no, I should put in a card that's has to be a woman. I won't make concessions. Well, is that the same for you in this cube as far as it must have been originally printed?
Yeah, so when I built the cube, I was like, I had ideas of all ways I could relax the restrictions. But sort of like when you think about a game design philosophy, normally what I think about, and one thing we do at Wizards, is start with all the restrictions, and then you can pull back layers of restrictions until you get to the minimum necessary restriction over time. Because if you start with lifting some of the restrictions, you'll never know how deep you can go into the restrictions. So I started with the most possible constraints, right? Only cards from Commander products, nothing else. Then I had a lot of things in mind, like I could add lands from other products if I wanted to. I could add cards from ancillary sets. I could expand it in all kinds of different ways. I don't even use there's some cards that have technically the correct expansion symbol, like the Scene Box cards, but I decided to exclude them because they weren't from Commander products. So there's some things I could pick up, but just to help narrow it down, I'm like, let's carve out as much as possible and see what I can do. So yes, the way it's struck is it must fit those requirements, and nothing else outside of that is there, except for basic lands, of course.
I totally respect that. May, you had a question that I interrupted. I apologize.
No, what I was going to ask was, do you find it challenging to recontextualize a lot of these Commander cards into a limited environment? And do you ever have, let's say, player experiences where a card that normally would work in Commander, let's say Territorial Hellkite, suddenly is too strong or too weak in this environment?
I really enjoy that. I thought it was really fun during the drafts that I've watched to see people see cards and have to totally reevaluate them, right? Like a card like Dockside Extortionist or whatever, I actually just cut from the cube, despite being a card that was so strong and ended up getting the Accent Commander. That is a card that is actually not very strong in a one-on-one game that you're drafted, right? Maybe make a treasure token. Another card that I think a lot of people slam and find out it's actually not as strong because of the makeup of the cube is Opposition Agent. Opposition Agent is strong even in normal cube, right? Like a Legacy cube or something, Opposition Agent is quite strong. But because we so seldom print search effects in our Commander decks, especially ones for specific cards, it's just not as strong here as it could be other places. Meanwhile, there are cards that you've never played in Commander before, or maybe never seen from some old Commander decks, that are quite strong and are quite playable. There's this card, Unquenchable Fury. It's from the Neon Kamigawa Commander deck. I don't think anyone's ever cast this card in one-on-one limited till this. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment aura, and whenever enchanted creature attacks, it deals damage to the defending player equal to the number of cards that player has in their hand. And then when it dies, it comes back to your hand. So, if you just play a 2-drop and then play that on turn 3 on your creature, you attack and they just take 10 damage. And that's just a card that, depending on how big your creature is, I guess. But they take a ton of damage. Maybe it's more like 7 damage, whatever. But it's still a wild card that in Commander is very forgettable. You never play with it. It's whatever, is a filler card in a precon. But here it actually is something quite interesting. So I really enjoy that recontextualization, and I think that makes it feel like a whole new Magic set, which is why I get that feedback a lot. Or even like a Master set where you're drafting a Horizon set or a Master set, and there's some reprint card you haven't seen before, and you have to kind of put it into a new context. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy cubes that make you have to recontextualize and think about things and evaluate cards you never played with or haven't played with in a long time. So I find that pretty enjoyable.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's definitely a cool part about your environment.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that, following on from that conversation, so there's cards, certainly when I'm looking at, let's say I'm either building a commander deck, right? And I've built plenty of commander decks, and I've typically shied away from cards that target or specify a single opponent. But now you've got this freedom with that to say, if it is a card that only looks at one opponent or only impacts one opponent, then that makes it a very, 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 very powerful card in a cube environment when you're only playing on one versus playing in a commander game where you're looking for ways that you can either punish or have impact on everybody at once. So that, to me, tell me if that was sort of part of your design process for this. Were you looking at that sort of element of the cards where they were? Because something like a great example is, what's 3 mana blue, protection from a player?
Your Nemesis.
Yes, thank you. So that's a card that is okay in a 4-player game or a 5-player game or any kind of multiplayer game, but very strong in a 1v1 environment.
Yeah, it's funny. That was actually exactly the card I was going to use as my example, which is it. So when building the cube, I thought that was an interesting thing to consider, but mostly I just evaluated the individual cards on, like, is this card good enough to make the cut? Because you don't have that many options, right? Like, so there's only a few thousand cards you get to choose from in the first place. But I do think that's the interesting part of the design. So True Name is actually interesting. So you'll notice there's one thing I did exclude from the cube, or 2 things technically, which is I excluded all Monarch and Initiative cards because they're just so not fun in one-on-one play, right? They're built for multiplayer play, and a lot of games boil down to, like, oh, I got the Monarch, I protected it, the game is over because you can't beat my free Phyrexian Arena every turn. So I knew before even making the cube, I put that restriction on myself. Nope, not going to include those. I don't think they're going to be very, very fun. The card after that, there's only one card that I excluded from the cube besides that, and that card was True Name Nemesis. With my philosophy being that it just makes games less fun, right? Like, it's a card that is pretty unfun to play with or against, or at least play against. And so my first several playtests, I actually did not include that card in there. But eventually, the thing is, everyone expected it to be there. Like, oh, great, a queue of commander cards. That means you've got True Name Nemesis. And it's like, well, no. And then I had to, run down my whole thing. And I realized eventually that it was just right to put it in. Also, one thing I think is quite interesting about this cube is I feel like the power levels of each color is almost inverted from what you would expect in a normal Legacy cube. In a normal Legacy cube, I'd say something like blue and black are the strongest colors. You can argue with me on that, but it goes like blue, black, green, blue at the top, then black, then green. Maybe you argue about blue and black, maybe, or argue about those, whatever. And usually red and white are at the bottom, with the note that if you can draft a mono red aggro deck or mono white aggro deck, it can be quite strong. All the colors are playable in Legacy cube, don't get me wrong, but that's probably how you would rank your power levels. Well, in Commander, a lot of the cards that have been made have been printed, especially recently, to help shore up things that are missing, because we don't need to print another 1-mana cantrip in a Commander deck. Like, you got those, you can already reprint those. So a lot of the cards we made are like red card advantage or white card advantage or mana ramp in white and all this stuff. So kind of what you're used to is a little turned on its head. And what we found is, I think blue is actually the weakest color probably in the cube, not by like an unplayable amount. And certainly when you look through the 3.0 decks of CubeCon, there's all the colors are represented. But I'm putting a card in that would be like, oh, I'm first picking this, or I'm seeing this, I'm switching into blue, I'm going blue, was actually, I think, a boon to the overall draft experience. And I made sure to build in enough answers to True Name Nemesis. There are some really strong combinations you can do with it. Like the first time I put it in, there's this card, Scavenged Brawler, I think is its name, that you can exile from your graveyard to put 4 +1/+1 counters, a first strike, lifelink, flying, and vigilance counter on a creature. And so they did that with True Name Nemesis, and it was very hard to beat the 7-power first strike, flying, lifelink, protection from everything creature with vigilance. But that kind of emergent gameplay I think is pretty fun. So anyway, that's a good specific example. But yeah, there were. I didn't exactly think about that as a reason to include or not include a card, but it is funny and charming when it happens sometimes. There's also a lot of cards that just have half the text box as irrelevant text, which I think is funny, maybe. One of my favorite examples of this is the card Loyal Apprentice, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 with haste. And then if you control your commander at the start of your combat step, you make a 1/1 Thopter, and the Thopter gains haste. But of course, all that is irrelevant. So really, it's just 1 red, 2/1 haste with 5 more lines of text after that. And so there's a bit of that I find charming. But mostly it's like, well, what do you have to work with, and starts from there. I also appreciate that it gives a very clear direction going forward. It's like, oh, every time a new commander set comes out, I'll look at the cards. There's only a handful of cards I have to evaluate. It's not a full set's worth, and I can decide if I want to put them in or not.
I will say that kind of threw me off a little bit when I was doing some playtesting, because I'm someone that, like, you look at a text box and you think, wow, look at all the words on that card. That must do so much. But you've got to kind of rewrite how you're evaluating these cards, because I'm looking at Commander Ninjutsu, which takes up like half the text box on a card. Like, okay, well, that's not going to be relevant. But you kind of answered this early on, that you've stayed
and
very
Commander Ninjutsu, by the way, you can still work from your hand. So don't let that be.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
I didn't think about that either.
Yeah, that is his own. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah.
You got tricked. Befuddled.
I did.
You got
I've been
distracted by
drafting
the
the heck out of
attitude
this.
distraction.
I've been drafting this cube, and today I was pretty proud of myself because I think I built a pretty sick artifact-centric deck with like Duretti, and I've got Feldon in there, and I'm just doing a triplicate Titan. I'm going bananas. Like, I was pretty proud of myself. I should too. So aside from artifacts, what type of how are you extrapolating archetypes out of this cube? What's the methodology?
It's a good question. So I think it's so interesting. When Cube started, like, you think about your classic legacy cube. When I first started cubing, oh my gosh, this has been 15 plus years ago now. Archetypes weren't really a thing, right? People just like put a bunch of good cards in a cube and you drafted and you built your deck based on it. And then what we did is, starting in Theros, when we really started doing this, we created this idea of draft archetypes. And where every 2-color combination has an archetype that you can build. And of course, this has gone on in our sets all the way through today. And this has become so well known and so popular that now many cube designers build in 2-color archetypes into their cubes, which I think is great and wonderful. That y'all are using the same technology that we use. I think that works great for some cubes. Like, it's really awesome to have a direction to hold on to. I think other times I do enjoy the more emergent gameplay of like, oh, I'm just figuring out the combinations as I go along. And in this cube, one thing I knew from the get-go is archetypes weren't really going to be possible. Like, if I tried to build archetypes into this cube, it wouldn't really work, because either it would be a bunch of cards from one deck that don't have the right cost of the right mana range. There's not enough support for any given thing necessarily to make it work. You end up with what I would call siloed things where, oh man, it's a bunch of time counters cards, and if you draft only the time counters cards, your deck will work, but otherwise you don't want these cards in any deck, which I think is not that enjoyable. And once again, you don't have that many cards to go through. So instead of doing that, what I built in were a lot of what I would call micro packages, where you have a small number of cards that can work together really well, and you don't always find them together, but you can. So, for example, artifacts and artifact creatures, there's some great micro packages across the cube for those. Your whole deck is not going to be artifact creatures, but you can draft some and you get your synergies to work. Energy is another one. There's just some energy cards hanging out in there, and 5 or 6 of them. Your deck ends up with 2 or 3 in the red-white color combination. Great, you have a little bit of micro synergy going on. So I focus more on a couple of micro packages you could kind of build, but making a full-blown archetype work was very challenging. I'll give you a great example, actually. So we've done a lot of commander decks that are blue-red or blue-red-X instant and sorcery decks. Easy, right? We've done that a billion times. So I was like, oh, well, naturally what I do is you put all these cards in. So my first draft of the cube, the first time we did it, had all these blue and red cards that cared about instant sorceries mattering. And I was like, awesome, you can kind of build an archetype, it works out great. But one of the problems is, if you think about it, yeah, it's true we've made all those cards, made all the rewards, but the payoffs are all usually like the 1 and 2 mana cheap efficient spells that we're just reprinting into the commander decks, right? It's your Ponders, your Preordains, your Brainstorms, your Faithless Lootings, whatever, and we're not making more of those. We're not putting those in commander products to start. So actually, the cube in general has a low instant sorcery density, and especially a low density of cards you'd want to play in these blue-red kind of prowessy decks, because those cards have already existed and we just reprint them in. So I cut, as a result, a lot of instant sorcery matters cards from the cube, I guess.
That was going to be one of the questions that we focused, because I was trying to understand your patterns of choices, because we're going to talk about, like, again, we like to take the Cube Cobra map, the table, and lay it out, which we'll get to soon. But when Stu and I were noticing it, the balancing of instant sorceries, creatures, etc., looked very, I guess, intentional. And I was going to ask you if you were making those choices based on like a retail limited type scenario that you would design, or were the pieces just falling into place and that's just the way it happened?
Yeah, the choices are based on the ingredients in the cupboard, basically, because I keep coming back to this, but you only have so many options. And in Commander, a lot of spell effects are often put on creatures, right? You got an ETB effect on your creature and what have you. And you just have less of the efficient, cheap spells, right? You don't have Swords of Plowshares or Path to Exile or Preordain or Ponder or Faithless Looting or what have you. And furthermore, many of the spells that do exist are multiplayer focused spells. You and target player both draw 3 cards. Okay, well, that's never going to make the cut in any one-on-one deck that I build, you know? So there just is fewer of those that I think you'll want to play here. I'm totally keen to put more in as they come out, but these don't really exist right now. So a lot of it really is, I mean, I appreciate that you're like, wow, the genius of this cube and the way these pieces interlock. But so much of it is like, well, I only had these pieces. So I cut the ones that didn't make sense. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I had a lot of choices I had to make and a lot of very careful crafting I had to do. I'm sure there's a lot of things that seem obvious to me that would not seem obvious to someone who doesn't think about making magic sets all day long, right? There's a lot of paths I just chose not to walk down. But I think ultimately, like, a lot of the spells just don't really work, and the creatures often fit the bill for that instead.
I would actually say that this kind of aligns in some way with, we have a good friend of ours, Bill, who we play with quite regularly. He has this like almost synergy cube where he's got the all pockets of synergy cube, and it's like you've fallen into that just based on the fact that you've got this restriction on the cards need to be originally printed in these Commander products. So that presents, and I am a player at heart. I am not the fancy and ingenious cube curator like you guys are. I am coming this very much from the player experience and the drafter experience. That for me presents a wonderful and most welcome challenge where you are looking for those pockets of synergy. And I love that terminology, where you are really just looking for, if I can even just find 2 or 3 cards within this 40 card deck that I've put together, sometimes that is enough to just push this little pocket that I've put together over the edge and give me enough to win an extra game or so here or there that I might otherwise not be able to if I hadn't been able to find those pockets. And it really does make it challenging as a player and as a drafter to find those, but it certainly does make it fun.
I have a card that I think exemplifies what Stu is saying, and I kind of want to talk about. Like, when I was looking at your cube, I'm like, you have glue cards, and we've kind of got to the point where you've said that you did this with intent, but Sith Eradicator, I think I said that right, or Synth Eradicator. English is not my strong suit. But 2 colorless and 1 red, you got a 3/3 haste. Whenever Synth Eradicator attacks, exile the top card of your library. You may get 2 energy, and then you can tap it, pay 3 energy. Synth Eradicator deals 3 damage to any target. So I'm looking at this as primary, secondary, tertiary type of effects when I'm drafting your cube. So the rate was good, basically 3 for 3. It had haste, so I can use it in aggro package, but I also saw you had some bleed over into energy, but you also had some bleed over into artifacts. Like, this card just really like touched 4 different sections of the cube. Was that intentional when you're choosing these cards?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing about Synth Eradicator is I think that's a great example. This is a great one for you to bring up because it's a card that is rated, so you'll play it with no synergies, right? It's a fine card. Just put it in your deck, like you said. Totally reasonable card to play. But because you now have that card in your deck, the next time you see an energy card, you're like, maybe I could put this in. Or you see an Artifact Matters card, you're like, maybe I could use this. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So you're spot on, right? It's these little pocket synergies where you're like, okay, well, because I'm playing this card anyway, that makes me 8% more likely to put this other card in my deck. And once I have those 2 cards in my deck, wow, the 3rd energy card I see, I really want to pick up. And, frankly, because they're commander cards and the rates on a lot of these cards are high anyway, a lot of them are just priced to move at their base. And then when you're drafting and evaluating, you get this kind of interesting decision of, okay, well, because I took this earlier card, I want to take this card differently, which is one thing I really enjoy. Like, I love build around uncommons, like wacky build around uncommons in draft and just any draft. And I feel like this is that, but a bunch of times over, right? Sometimes you'll take cards just based on the rate, but other times you are looking at like your tiny little synergy packages. For example, one you might not even have noticed, there's a card called Scholar of Lost Horizons. I love this card. I also designed it, so I guess I'm biased. But it's 1 and a white for a 1/1. It comes into play with a +1/+1 counter. And you can tap it and remove a counter from a permanent you control to search your library for planes. And if your opponent has more lands than you do, you put it into play. Otherwise, you put it into your hand. Okay, so this card, totally on its own, fine. 2 mana, 2/2. It taps to get you a land. Maybe if you're on the draw, it ramps you. Great card, right? But, okay, what if once you have this in your deck, you're like, okay, well, all these +1/+1 counter cards get a little bit better. Cool, that's great. Oh, actually, I found a charge counter artifact. That's interesting. And then at some point, you're thinking about how to use it with +1/+1 counters and charge counters, all this stuff. And then at some point, your friend leans over and is like, hey, did you know that sagas use counters. You're like, oh wow, this plus any saga means I can keep repeating the same chapter of a saga indefinitely. And so there's these like little tiny synergies and packages that might just make one card lean you in a very different direction. For better or worse, because basically every card in a commander deck is considered a rare, every new card is considered a rare, a lot of these cards have a ton going on with them. And the downside of that is it does take a while to draft because there's a lot to read, especially if you don't know the cards. But the upside of that is there's so many different tiny angles you can hook into and little synergies that you might not normally see on your first draft. And so I've had friends come and draft this time and time again just because they're like, okay, now that I've drafted it once or twice, I want to try this thing next time, which I think is pretty fun.
So you'll see the section that I put in the show notes that we're going to exclude. And it was originally like me saying, and we may talk about it a little bit, but it was about your mana base, about the lands. But we'll tie into that here shortly.
And I think you're like, put in some shocklands, put in some.
You know exactly what we're going to do. But I don't want to go.
No, well, let's.
Stu's going to want to do it.
But, well, mana is as a talking point. We've had a lot of curators on where we've talked about the mana base. A lot of times, May will tell you, May is someone who has put a very specific restriction on the lands that she's put in her cube, just like other curators, to say, I want to place that restriction on my players to not be able to enable and support the 4, 5, even 3 color good stuff decks that can become too prevalent in a cube. And I want the players to be able to pick a lane and use the synergies that the curator has put together to enhance the drafting and the playing experience. And I totally get that. Obviously, you've got a restriction in yours as far as the lands, and any other card has to have been originally printed in a commander product. If it was me, and it's so, I don't know, maybe this is ego speaking, or I don't know, but I feel like lands is like the first place that I would look as a curator. I don't care about anything else in the queue, but if there's one place that I would pull a restriction back in order to maybe support the fact that you've got those, those options for the lands, it would be that. I think everything else I would include it, and I think I would be very specific about that. But you've got things like the Mirage fetch lands, and there's been some pretty good lands, obviously, in the other commander products. But maybe just that single restriction, and certainly not as a criticism. It's just because that is a feedback that, and honestly, a lot of curators ask that about their mana base.
Gavin, since we've jumped the shark here, or literally the show notes, because I knew the minute I talked about that with Stu, he's going to do it. But I did the math, and you've got 31 non-basics, and you've got thriving lands, filter lands, battle bond lands, and forms of utility lands, which comes in at about 7% of the cube. And what we're accustomed to, and what I've brought my cubes up to, is about 14%, emulating like a retail limited type of scenario, I guess. And the reason why I mentioned it, I want to double back and take all this away. You tell me where you stand, but if it were printed in a commander product and I put down bounce lands, pain lands, utility lands, taking you up to 56 to get you to the 14, is that something as a curator that just breaks your rules?
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess I'll say a bunch of different things here, and because I have a lot of opinions. So I know the man in the cube is bad. I knew that before I made the cube because your options are so limited, right? I mean, for everyone at home listening, I really want to think home. Your options are like the enemy Odyssey untapped filter lands, the battle bond dual lands that come into play tapped every time because you only have one opponent, so they're just like whatever your tap lands you find in a set that don't gain you a life, and then the thriving lands, which can fix your colors.
The thriving lands are great.
Generally that strong.
I like.
So your options are weak, and of course I did think about should I break it for your mana base. However, a couple things happened. One thing that I found is that I kind of align with some other cube creators, perhaps, that I find a lot of cube environments are getting a little soupy. They're like 3+ color decks. It's so easy to splash. Once you get fetch shocks in there, getting other colors in is super easy. And I really enjoyed the idea of what if we went back to kind of more traditional 2-color gameplay or 2-color splash, a 3rd-color gameplay. We really have to mean it if you want to play more colors. And once I decided to do that, what I did, and you might not have noticed this, or maybe you did, is I excluded any 3+ colored cards from the cube. Now, there's tons of great 3+ colored options, right? Commander has plenty of cool legendary creatures that are printed at 3+ colors. But I decided to not even make that a thing you would try and aspire to do. I'm like, let's not try and trick anybody. Let's not give you a Bant card and make you try and mess your mana base up to try and do it. So really, like the cube is pushing you toward playing 2 colors with the ability, like I said, to splash a third sometimes. And once I did that, like I had it as an option in my head, I was ready to be like, if I got to pull back on this, I will. But look, dude, I love drafting lands first pick. I've done it so many times. I will first pick a polluted delta, but I enjoy that here. It's just a little more of that classic 2-color gameplay. One other thing that I think it does, it goes back to some stuff we were talking about earlier, is I do really enjoy how this cube forces you to reevaluate your pick orders. For example, a 1 or a 2 drop in this cube, you just have to prioritize higher because there are just fewer of them. There are 2 drops to go around, but if you don't pick them highly enough, there's no guarantee you're going to find them in the third pack. And 1 drops, there's very, very seldom. I think each color gets one mana creature. That's as many as you get, basically. And lands are very much of the same vocation to me. Oh, pinpoint removal spells, by the way, same deal. Like cheap pinpoint removal, there isn't a lot of it. And so lands are the same vocation to me, where it's like, oh, it's kind of interesting that because there's so few lands, like I watched someone first pick an Odyssey untapped filter land. They're like, I just need to have mana fixing for my deck. This is one of the only shots I'm going to have at it, so I'm going to take it right here. And kind of in line with a lot of what I was saying about the rest of this cube, where it forces you to reevaluate things. Yeah. I personally find that enjoyable. Now, is that something I find enjoyable because I've drafted 100 cubes and I've drafted 1,000 times? Probably, right? If this is my 8th booster draft ever, that would be maybe a little less enjoyable. But hey, I get to make the rules, so I decided made it work for me. Cool. I could totally imagine a world where, yeah, you if you wanted to put those things in, you could. But it's sort of like, I was drafting at CubeCon this year, and I always make it a rule to play a Peasant Pauper cube. I personally enjoy that kind of gameplay. I enjoy the the 2-for-1 innings and the attacking with small creatures and trying to get the job done, whatever. And this year I did something different, which is I played the Peasant cube it was the Peasant Plus cube. So it was Peasant, but it had the mana base. I had, whatever, Shockland, Fetchland style mana base stuff. And I personally found that I enjoyed that a lot less than normal because part of the fun to me was trying to get it all to work. It's like, okay, I've got to play my 3-color deck, but my mana fixing is gates and I'm doing all this stuff, what have you. And having access to all that stronger mana fixing, I liked a little less because it was really at odds to me with what I believe the philosophy or what I expected from the format. The last thing I'll say is, of course, if they were printed for the first time in a Commander deck, I would include them. I think you asked that question. Yeah. So if you're like, oh, we're printing a brand new cycle of dual lands that are sick in 1-on-1, of course, I'd put them in because they fit the description. But it would take that happening a lot of times to get anywhere near the quality that Legacy cubes have now. So
I'm dying to hold my hand up. Stu is he's slapping my hand down. But the one you drafted last year was our good friend Sammich's Peasant Cube. Yeah. That was the one that was a traditional Peasant Cube. I believe you got an opportunity to play that one. So giving a shout out to him.
Yeah, and I loved it. I had a great time playing it. And I try to do a Peasant Cube every year. I always enjoy them. And this year I was like, I'll try the Peasant Plus Cube, which I still enjoyed. I had a great time, don't get me wrong. But for me, personally, I enjoyed the good mana bases a little bit less. But obviously that's the taste, right? Like other people might have enjoyed it more. So maybe I'm just at the point where it's like, give me a challenge. I want a challenge. I don't want your normal sneaking magic. So
if it makes you feel better, I actually agree with you. I am very much of a proponent of good mana bases can tend to lead to more soupy cubes. And when you have restrictions on what kind of colors and how fast they have access to those colors, it leads to interesting drafting decisions that people don't really think about. The other part of it is just how easily aggro packages get access to multiple colors. This is just an example, because aggro is just such a big center point on the balance of a cube. And I find it cathartic, let's say, to have somebody else appreciate just having a bad mana base and being okay with it.
And I want to clarify, like, I'm not advocating here, hey, Gavin, please put in all the sharks, all the fetches, all the Abrador lands. Like, obviously, I am very appreciative of the fact that it's a Commander product cube. And there are obviously other lands that have been printed in Commander products that were not originally being printed in the Commander products. So again, things like the Mirage fetch lands that are obviously very slow and there's no other duels, so you're limited to only being able to get a basic, but sometimes that's just enough to make, a little bit of a difference in the play experience, but maybe not open up the drafting experience so that you're being able to enable these 3, 4, 5 color decks. But yeah, I totally get it. So look, I've said my piece on the lands.
Concession.
I've done. That's it. That's all I wanted to say on the lands.
And to me, I mean, I think it's totally season to taste thing, right? All these restrictions you could peel back any one of them if you wanted to. If you're the kind of drafter who enjoys that kind of gameplay or wants to be able to do that a little bit more, that's fine. And look, I'll be critical of my own thing. I talked with Mini Draft. Overall, the reception was very positive at CubeCon. People had a really good time drafting it. People really enjoyed it. They came up to me afterwards, and a very common response was, I like this more than I thought I would, which, thank you, I guess. But But a number of players were like, hey, the mana's bad. Like I tried to do what I normally did in a draft and felt like I was misled. And that will happen, right? That is the downside of doing that, is people that come in who are cube aficionados and don't think about the fact that mana is rougher. They're just they're gonna try drafting 3-color deck, and it's gonna be a little tougher sometimes. Now, one thing I did do is I was like, okay, well, if I want you to be able to play 3 colors sometimes, but I want you to really mean it. And so I put in the bobbleheads. So there's a bunch of bobbleheads in there for mana fixing. There's a number of 3 mana rocks, but the bobbleheads are really the kind of the big exemplary examples for these. They're not particularly strong mana fixing pieces, but if you need to fix your mana, they're there. So like it's kind of the thing where you gotta eat your vegetables. Like if you want to do this, you gotta play a couple 3 mana rocks in your deck, and maybe that's fine, right? Like if you're playing a control deck, like Summer's not that bad. They're a far cry from the 2 mana rock.
Are they not that strong? Because I feel like it's only 3 mana. They do add 1 mana of any color. All of them have a pretty nice
I love them.
activated ability. And in a cube where, again, you've got this restriction as far as the commander product. So no one's looking to storm off on turn 1 or 2 or 3. No one's going bonkers in the first 3 or 4 turns. A lot of the power plays really do seem to be in that 3 to 4 to maybe, and certainly into 5 mana where you've got some really, really powerful plays, definitely at 4, but into 5 as well. When I was drafting this cube and I was play testing, I was taking these at every single opportunity, both for those 2 reasons. Number 1, the fact that they have got that ability to fix and accelerate your mana, and also the fact that all of them have not just a cool ability or a powerful ability, but a fun one as well.
And they're from that Fallout set, which is like the best commander set. Like I absolutely love everything about that set. But the one thing that I thought was cool is kind of what he said. They stack on each other. And it made me, when I drafted 20 plus times of your cube, I did choose to recalibrate my normal, I guess, decision making on, I'm not trying to get premium lands. I'm trying to get premium rocks. And these are beautiful.
Trains. They're the Monopoly trains.
I was going to chain them. I chained them. Like you've got one in here in particular that I was actually just in love with for a control deck. It's Perception Bobblehead for 3 colorless, and the Artifact Bobblehead. You can tap it for any color, as Stu mentioned, but you can also pay 3 colorless, tap it. Look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of bobbleheads you control, so they stack. You may cast a spell with mana value 3 or less from among them without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of the library in any random order.
It's nice when they
that
pay
is
for themselves,
a fantastic card.
Yeah.
So this was glue for me in the builds when I was constructing on Cube Cobra. So love them. Great choices.
Yeah, and I would say that's kind of goes hand in hand with the pockets of synergy I was talking about before, right? Once you've committed to playing one bobblehead, you're like, I don't know, should I play another bobblehead in there? And then you kind of go down the list. So it does fit that philosophy, and I think some are stronger than others. So like some, I'll be like, yes, I definitely am interested in this. Some I'm like, a little bit less interested in this. Like there's the +X+O and haste one or something like that. You're like, maybe don't need that one quite as much. But yeah, I think they absolutely fit that bill. I did cut, sadly. One decision I made was to not have any die rolling in the cube. It was something I cut out just because some of the cards are very high variance for one-on-one play. And so when I made that, I painfully cut the luck bobblehead. So you cannot live the dream of drafting all the bobbleheads and winning the game by rolling 6 6s on a dice, which was never going to happen. But I did like the dream being there. But no, I ended up cutting that one. So, but the other ones are all in there.
I'm going to have to try I was thinking about when I'm playing it, I've got Uberbear's Artifact Cube. That was mine that was featured at CubeCon this year. It was me, this guy.
Okay.
And as I'm looking at the bobbleheads, I hadn't even really paid much attention to those cards until I started drafting your cube. So you've given me a newfound appreciation for all of those cards and what they could do in my cube if I supported them. So I'm looking at them now.
Well, so that's actually a great point to bring up, because one of my goals, and this happened at CubeCon, I was like, yes, is people draft the cube and they leave being like, I never seen this card before, and I should try it in my cube, right? And I was like, oh, that's awesome that a lot of people saw cards they never played with, because a lot of these commander cards, like, they don't go through any format. So a lot of cube aficionados, like that, you don't think to include them necessarily, especially some of the more medium profile ones. And learning that they exist and being like, oh, I want to go back and actually try that out in a cube I'm building or something like that, I think is very cool.
So we kind of talked about your power outliers. We kind of declared it true name Nemesis, but I identified several others. And I wanted to know how you counterpoint them in the cube. So the ones that I've identified in this case, because I drafted them, I found myself like drawn to them. I couldn't not pick them when I saw them. Was Mystic Confluence, Broadside Bombardiers, May, Gut True Zealot, Fractured Identity,
Sure,
and Mix and Boo. And then I put on Retrofitter Foundry too, but Stu kind of talked about that one. That one I think kind of blends out a little bit more.
My big two are Minx and Boo and Shorakai. Those are the ones that stick out to me the most. Shorakai's good card.
I would say, yeah, I agree. And the more, and I think this is what I love about Magic. I will say maybe personally, but I mature more the more I look at a list, at a cube, whatever. So I first looked at Fractured Identity and I'm like, wow, that seems really off the charts for this cube. But then I look at it and I think, hang on a second, a lot of these powerful plays though are at that 5-6 mana value, right? So yes, someone could pay 5 mana for a Fractured Identity, but then likely that I've got a good follow-up at that 5-6 mana value level as well. So while it's definitely a powerful card, it just doesn't seem, at least, and this is without me playing the cube, doesn't seem to be the just off the charts power, spike that it would be when I first.
It feels it feels a little muted in here.
It feels fair, and I think that's such a great term. Fair, I think, is a term that we use a lot to describe a card that just fits very well either in a cube or a form or whatever. That just seems to me, at least on the surface, to just fit that fair term because that's kind of where the power level is.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two things going on there. Two things going on here that I think are interesting. First of all, some of the cards on your list I think are power outliers. I'll get to them in a second. But one of the things I think is quite fascinating is once again you have to kind of contextualize some of this stuff. So like Gut, very powerful card, right? This is in Vintage Cube. You take it in your aggro deck. It's crazy strong. But with fewer 1 and 2 drops in the environment, it actually is a lot harder to make this card work here than otherwise. I'm not saying it's weak. I'm not saying you shouldn't play it. But like it's not the like, oh my gosh, I got to slam this and no one can beat it, that it can be in these older formats. So it's some of that bit of recontextualization, as you were saying, is interesting. The other thing is, like Minsk and Boo, I think is among one of the strongest cards in the cube. I think that's just true. It is 2 colors, so it really forces you to commit, but it is one of the strongest cards in the cube. True Name, same deal. Othari is a card that I think is extremely strong as well. It's also in this cube in 2 colors that forces you to kind of commit to it. But, cards that are power outliers, I think are okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a strong card in a cube that points you in a direction. I think that's part of what makes the draft dynamic and gets you out of your comfort zone. If you always tend to draft controlling decks and then you see Broadside Bombardiers, you're like, oh, maybe today's the draft a more aggressive deck. So, yeah, I have no problem with there being power outliers. The only one that I really had to put in checks and balances for out of all of those was True Name, because I just need to make sure there are ways in the cube for you to actually interact with it. So I put a couple slightly weaker cards in the cube that will probably float and maybe end up in sideboards that can help fight a True Name Nemesis. But other than that, I mean, way to fight Minsk and Boo is like attack it, something, there's do your best. But I will say, I have seen, Minsk and Boo is quite a strong card, don't get me wrong, but I have seen a lot of players go 1-2 or even 0-3 with Minsk and Boo in their deck because, like any draft deck, it's not the only thing that's there. And if you draw it late, it's not as strong as if you play it on turn 4. Of course, if you play turn 4, you're probably going to win if you have any kind of a creature backup. But yeah, some of that is okay.
I want to follow that up as well with sort of mixing the two conversations that we had. So as far as the power outliers and how Anthony likes to use this term, games have to end, right? So you want sometimes just those powerful cards to exist to end games. So maybe there's possibility for room there with and you said that you were very specific in the 3-color, a lot of powerful creatures, a lot of powerful cards that have been printed in that 3-color. Has there ever been, or have you, or recently even thought about maybe including those? Because maybe the mana bases might not be there to include the 3-color as a consistent option, but I still think with the inclusion of the bobbleheads, and certainly in green, there's some great options for mana fixing, to maybe include some of those 3-color cards as either a synergy piece or just a fun piece. Because I think, like, again, so much fun there with some of those 3-color commander, legendary creatures in particular.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I thought about it. I had a list of ones that I considered for sure. A couple of things going on. One is certainly not, and this is true of any cube, certainly not all 3-color cards are created equal. So there's a bit of a power imbalance even in a normal cube. And it's exacerbated here because there's just fewer options to choose from. So some are a lot weaker than others. But the bigger thing to me, even looking beyond that, because that's also true of 2-color gold cards as well. The bigger thing, even looking beyond that to me, is just that I would love to say that humans are restrained, that you'd be like, no, I'm not going to take the 3-color card this time. I'm going to be well disciplined. But we know that's not true, right? You see the sweet 3-color legend, and a lot of players would be like, oh, great. I see this, I'm taking it, I'm playing it. And when you see a 3-color
People
card in
like
a
their
cube,
big stinky cards.
I'm taking it pick one, pack one.
they do.
I like a challenge,
and, something
baby.
we talked
Let's
a
go.
lot about on Magic design is the promise of a card. And when you see it, when you open a card in a pack and you're drafting, the card promises you can do something. It says, okay, this is here. This promises to me that this is supported by the game designer or by the cube designer. And when I open a 3-color card in this cube, if I haven't done a lot of research on the cube, that tells me that promise to me is, hey, I can pull this off in this cube. It's like if you open a pack and see a Storm card, the cube is clearly promising to you, hey, Storm is supported here, right? There's not just like a one-off empty the warrens with no support. That would be the biggest troll, you know? And so given that the cube can't support three color, at least across a lot of people that well, I'd rather not include them and not provide that promise to people that they could do it. Because otherwise, you either end up with a lot of people train wrecking themselves or 3-color cards going last, which I think is not ideal necessarily. So I could see including them. I could see them including them at some point in the future potentially, but I don't feel like they're super missed right now. And I saw a good combination of 2 and 3-color decks looking at the CubeCon decks that were drafted. So maybe they could go in at some point, but I don't feel strongly about it.
I think I agree with you. The slot equity is too important. And I think the bobbleheads, once we've announced this going forward, the bobbleheads are going to be highly contested if they weren't already. Like, those were premier fixing in this cube for me. So if there was a 3-color, I would find there would be a fight for those, especially if you had multiple, if you covered all the different shards and wedges and whatnot. It could become problematic. So we do one thing during every episode that's really important. It's kind of the Mari Povich type thing. You are the combo type of scenario. So I ran the Commander Spellbook to find out what combos existed. Are you familiar that there's some infinite combos in your cube?
Yeah. Oh, I built them in intentionally. Well, at least,
all right.
At least one of them. I mean, they mostly involve Astral Dragon.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Yeah, in fact, I drafted my cube at CubeCon, and I drafted an Astral Dragon combo deck, which I never got to do until CubeCon, but I was so excited to draft.
That's pretty sick, right? So did you do that with the, what is it, the effigy? It's the Machine God's effigy, or did you do it with...
Mirror.
Oh, yeah, Cursed Mirror.
Yeah. So, right, it's like basically this is the Splinter Twin Pestermite of the cube, right? It's for those who don't know the cards, Cursed Mirror is a mana rock, and when it comes into play, or it comes into play as a copy of something for a turn, so it clones something for a turn, and then there's a mana rock afterwards. Astral Dragon, when it comes into play, you choose, it's an 8-mana creature, so it's quite expensive, but when it comes into play, you choose a non-creature permanent and make 2 3/3 copies of it. So if you have a non-creature Cursed Mirror, you play the Astral Dragon, it creates 2 copies of the Cursed Mirror, you make them enter as copies of the dragon, rinse and repeat until you have a billion hasty dragons. In fact, really, really fun story. I was playing against Nicole Tipple, or Snap. What's her last name? Nicole Dubin. I was playing against Nicole Dubin.
Yes,
Dubin in the draft at CubeCon, and we were 1-1, and we were playing the third game, and time was called. I drafted this blue-red deck, and it goes turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and it comes back to me on turn 5, and she's at like 20 life, whatever, and in one turn I go Cursed Mirror, copy nothing. Astral Dragon to do like the kill from hand thing, right? And then, so I execute the combo, I make infinite 3/3s, and I attack, and she has VATS, V-A-T-S, which kills any number of creatures with equal power and toughness. And so it fizzles my combo, and the game goes to a draw, right? Which was really wild. So it was a really great moment.
That's a story you're going to retell us at the end of time.
Yeah, it's memory making type play.
It was really good.
That's awesome.
Really so I'm aware that combo is there, and you can draft it. And I built it in intentionally. I thought it'd be fun to have something there. Once again, it's that micro synergy. You see the Astral Dragon, you're like, if I see a Cursed Mirror, maybe I want to take it. Just like how you have Pestermite, Kiki-Jiki, or what have you going around. There is one that I saw in your show notes that I did not know about, which is Charismatic Conqueror and Fractured Identity.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yep.
How does this work?
I don't know. I can Google it real quick. We can run it.
There were a lot of like pluses on there. I
pulled it up on the Commander Spellbook, and when you pull that up, it explains. You can take it, export out your list, put it in the Commander Spellbook. It'll break it down for you.
So it draws the game by making infinite creature tokens for the opponents, infinite ETB.
Doesn't
for the
win.
opponents,
it just locks everybody.
It may just be because I'm trying to
Whenever
see.
an artifact or creature enters the battlefield
they
untapped
may
under an
tap
opponent's
if
control,
they
they may tap a permanent. If they don't, then you create a 1/1 white.
There's
vampire.
got to
So I
be
think it's like
another permanent.
if people opt into doing it, there's infinite creatures made or something, but it's a May, so I don't think it like infinitely ends the
Right.
game or anything like that. And it requires them opting in. So I feel like maybe that only works in multiplayer or requires people opting in or whatever, but it doesn't seem real for this cube. I think it's just Astral Dragon is the only combo.
Yeah.
Combo card.
Yeah, which is
I would
very
agree.
much like a live the dream type thing. As you said, it's memory making, and that's what makes cubes so great, right? I mean, ultimately, that's what we're here
And still
for.
the story
'cause
I had as a memory, right?
you aren't going to forget that. It's forever burned in. Like, yeah, I mean, kind of like when I beat Stu last night with my demon deck with a
Did
goat.
Anthony got his yearly victory last night, so he's going to talk about it.
Yeah, I got my yearly, and
Well, the year's almost over, so watch out.
That's right.
that goat that turns into a demon is fantastic. Whatever. Oh my god, from Dustmorn, I was like, oh my god, I'm totally
go,
kill you with this
baby.
goat. You've been a fantastic guest, and we're so excited to have you on. And we don't want to hold up too much for your time. We know you're a busy person, just like the rest of us. We got to get about our things. But is there anything that you learned from CubeCon about your cube? Like anything you didn't know?
Well, I feel like, and this is, maybe a boring answer or a very back patty answer, but I really felt like I looked through all the 3.0 decks, looked through all the decks people drafted. I talked to a lot of players, and I was just really impressed by how much it really stood up. Like I think red and white are the strongest colors, but like all the colors ended up 3-0ing. A lot of people said they had a good time. A lot of novel cards in there. A couple cards I was like, maybe I'll cut these or whatever. So there's a few little notes on individual cards, but on the whole, I felt like it was a big success and people had a great time with it. And I am planning to continue updating it, and I'll resubmit it to CubeCon next year, hopefully with another cube that I'm brewing up. So we'll see if it gets chosen again next year, but I've had a lot of fun working on this one. And the great thing is it's every commander set. I'm like, all right, let's look at the new cards. And actually, it's not really how it works because I know what all the new cards are. So I've already looked ahead to commander sets a year in the future and figure out what I'm going to put in. But
we don't know that.
But you heard it here first. Gavin is working
Yes.
on a new cube.
And we want that
Okay.
we want that exclusive,
We want that
Gavin.
exclusive.
When
Yeah,
you're
I was
ready to
gonna
talk
say,
about it, you let
right?
us know.
We want to be the AP on the new cubes.
I mean, I can tell you the cube. It's not a secret. It sounds pretty fun. I guess what's the biggest risk? I tell that someone else builds it and saves me the time of doing it. That seems fine. So the cube I want to build is, so I started playing with Invasion in 2001. That was when I started playing Magic. And there's kind of this period of Magic that is a little forgotten. And it's after Urza Block, before Mirrodin. So basically between bans, right? So Urza Block is crazy. All the cards are bananas. A bunch of bannings happen. Mirrodin is when Modern starts, or 8th edition, I guess technically, is when Modern starts. New card frame. All the bannings happen with Mirrodin. But there's a standard environment that goes from Masks, Invasion, Odyssey, Onslaught. It's kind of in the middle there with a core set, 7th edition in there as well. That had a lot of pretty memorable standard decks that are kind of lost to the sands of time, right? People talking about Fires of Yavimaya or Sapperling Burst or Rebels or Astral Slide, that kind of stuff. And so I'm trying to make a cube right now that sort of is the best of standard from those few years of Magic.
Nice.
I'm still building it out. My current thought is it's going to be a duplicate cube where every card is repeated twice. And that's basically the whole thing. So I'm not even close. In fact, I haven't even started yet. It's only an idea in my head, but it's going to be, I think, pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go through and flag all the constructed playable cards, whittle it down to the right number. I know a controversial thing in cube building is how big a cube should be. I personally do not enjoy cubes that every card is drafted every time. So mine always end up around the 400-ish range.
Yeah.
So probably being about 400 cards with a bunch of unique cards that are duplicated. Maybe they're all duplicated, maybe only some are, but sounds fun. And then I get to kind of show the new generation of Magic players what standard was back then, which I think is kind of novel and interesting. And there'll be archetypes like blue-green madness, red-white slide, red-green fires, that kind of stuff. So
I'm with you on that
I think it's
age
interesting
as far as
project.
the larger cubes. The reason why I do the 360s for the cons is just because I get a full count. I mean, ultimately, that's what it is, right? Because when we submit them, we kind of want to make sure everything's there and accounted for, et cetera.
It is a challenge as a player that you have to consider that when you're drafting, though, that like, hey, some of those pieces that you're maybe looking for,
Kiki might be in
if
the
you're
box.
looking for, Kiki conscripts, they might not be there, but
It's
I
fine.
think that's. But I would also say it's also indicative of a really fun cube where you've got there's that unknown element there where maybe that piece that you might be looking for isn't there. You have to shift your focus, and yeah, I like it. That's awesome.
I view that as a game designer. as actively good.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want someone to sit down and be able to be like, okay, I know that we're going to draft all the cards every time. I'm going to draft Kiki-Jiki, Pestermite. I know those are there.
Yep.
I want there to be a bit of mystery. I find it the same way to be fun when you're drafting a normal Magic set and you're like, I don't know if my Signpost Uncommon is going to be in this draft or not, because I want you to have variants from draft to draft. I think the more someone sits down and treats it like a tactics game where you've already figured out what you want to do before you draft, the less fun it is. And it's a lot more fun when you have to think on your feet and be like, okay, I don't know if this thing's going to be here or not. No, I'm not saying that your cube has to be 600 cards, but just injecting a little bit of variance, 400, 420, whatever, up to 500 really is kind of my sweet spot. The regular Games Commander cube, I started off at, I think, 430 cards or something like that. And by the end, I whittled it down to 400. I cut some of the stuff at the bottom, and I was like, okay, there's a little bit of variance. 40 cards aren't used every time. You can't guarantee something's going to be there, but, a lot of the cards are there every time. And I think that makes it fun and just adds to replayability, right? Because you don't know if something's going to be there in every draft. Maybe there is no Minsc and Boo or True Name this draft or whatever, as opposed to like, okay, I'm going to go red-green because I know Minsc and Boo will show up at some point. Hopefully it floats to me. I just find that less enjoyable.
Well, it's been really fantastic having you on, and we're truly honored to actually have you on the show. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Could you tell the listeners how they might reach out to you or what socials they might grab onto?
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find. It's just my name everywhere. So you can find me on Twitter at Gavin Verhey, Instagram at Gavin Verhey, TikTok at Gavin Verhey, all that stuff. The only place you can Google me and just click down the list. The only place that's not true for is, of course, my YouTube channel, which is Good Morning Magic. So go check that out. I post videos talking about how we design Magic cards and other stuff too. So go give that a listen.
It's awesome.
Fantastic. All right.
Let's first of all, without further ado, could not go a second further without giving a huge thanks to all of our patrons, including our latest, Chris Fitzgerald, thank you so much, as well as Timber Dragon, Brian Christensen, Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nick LaPointe, Preston, and Sam McKenna. A huge thank you to all of you guys. You're just keeping the lights on. And if there was no lights on, we wouldn't be able to see the cards that we're talking about,
I don't think we can anyways.
If you want to get in on the discussion, you can always check out the MTGFB, which stands for Facebook, for the Zoomers out there, drafting page at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube, where our resident host, Mr. Anthony Adams, is a moderator over there. And you know what that means?
Ban Hammer.
Ban Hammer. If you do enjoy this episode or any of our other episodes, we would really appreciate, give us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Really goes a long way to getting us out there to the greater community. And you can also support us by using our ultasleeves.com/UberCube affiliate link for 5% off purchase, or our inkedgaming.com/UberCube affiliate link. Go check them out. Dice bags, mouse pads, custom products, and large volume products available for your cube or any other Magic the Gathering experience. Reach out to us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. You can also email us via UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com if you've got a longer question or comment about your cube, Anthony's cubes, your own cube, someone else's cube. You can reach us at email, UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com if you've got a question about the podcast or an episode. And, as always, the UberCube Discord. Come check out, in particular, the Deckbows channel. What we've been seeing in there recently, I've been seeing some spice in that Deckbows channel.
Yeah.
All the spice. And again, www.patreon.com/UberCube. Come check us out. If you want to help us keep the lights on, really helps us out.
So now we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is Happy Cubing!